I am writing these words almost 5 months after a night that quietly rearranged the inside of my life. 5 months since something happened that did not remove me from power, did not strip me of responsibility, and did not allow me the luxury of retreat. I am still the president of Burkina Faso. I am still a military leader. I still wake each morning carrying the weight of terrorism, diplomacy, borders, hunger, fear, and the lives of millions. Yet I am not the same man who carried those burdens before. What changed did not happen on a podium. It did not happen in a church with cameras or in front of a crowd chanting my name. It happened in silence. It happened where no flag stands and no rank is recognized. It happened inside a man who had reached the limits of command and discovered that authority cannot heal a broken soul. I know how unusual this sounds. Stories of conversion often come with resignation letters, exile, or withdrawal from public life. Mine did not. I did not lose power. I did not step aside. I did not escape into private faith. Instead, I had to continue leading a nation that is not mine alone. A nation where Muslims form the majority, where Christians live beside them, and where ancestral beliefs still breathe in the soil. I had to carry a private transformation while guarding a fragile public balance. That tension is the reason I begin this account carefully. I am not here to persuade, recruit, or instruct. I am here to tell the truth as I lived it. I speak as a man who doubts himself often, who revisits his fears, and who admits that faith did not make leadership easier. It made it more honest. For most of my life, religion was something I inherited rather than something I encountered. I grew up in a Muslim family, shaped more by culture than by deep devotion. We respected tradition, we honored God. But faith was not a daily struggle of the heart. It was a structure that framed life, not a fire that consumed it. That is why what happened 5 months ago still unsettles me. It did not come from upbringing or pressure. It came uninvited, at a moment when strength had failed me, and it left me with a choice I could no longer postpone. I will begin where that choice first took root, in secrecy, fear, and hesitation. For several months after that night, my faith remained hidden, not because I was ashamed of it, but because I was afraid of what its exposure might do to others. Only a very small circle knew the truth. One trusted pastor, 2 close advisors, and a friend who had known me long before uniforms and titles defined me. Even among them, the subject was spoken of quietly, almost cautiously, as if words themselves could destabilize something fragile. The decision to keep silent was not made lightly. Burkina Faso is not a blank page where a leader may write his personal story without consequence. It is a living, wounded nation. Nearly 3/4 of our people identify as Muslim. Others follow Christ. Many still honor the spiritual paths of their ancestors. Our survival depends not on uniform belief but on mutual restraint. One careless declaration can ignite suspicion where trust once stood. My advisors were direct. They did not question my faith, but they questioned the timing. They reminded me that personal belief and presidential identity are not the same thing. A conversion, however sincere, could be weaponized by political enemies, twisted by extremists, or misunderstood by those already living in fear. They warned me that what begins as testimony could end as division. I listened to them because they were not wrong. I had already chosen to confront foreign pressure, to challenge old powers that once claimed ownership over our future. I had accepted sanctions, threats, and isolation, but this felt different. Political confrontation is visible, religious tension hides in hearts and spreads silently. I also had to face my own history. I had not grown up as a devout man. Faith for me had always been inherited, almost inherited out of respect rather than conviction. That made my transformation harder to explain, even to myself. How could I speak publicly of something I was still learning to understand privately? So I chose discretion. I read the Bible at night. After briefings and reports, I prayed before decisions that involved blood and borders. I met my pastor quietly, without announcement. My belief was real, but it lived behind closed doors. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Inwardly, everything had. Yet silence has a cost. Each day I felt a growing fracture between who I was becoming and who I was seen to be. I asked for wisdom, but I hid the source of that wisdom. I sought courage, but concealed the place from which it came. And slowly a question began to form that would not leave me alone. Was faith meant to be carried like contraband, useful but hidden? Or was it meant to shape a man openly, even when that openness carried risk? The question did not demand an immediate answer. It waited, and when it returned, it did not come as a thought, but as an encounter. The night it happened did not announce itself as sacred. There were no signs in the sky, no sudden clarity, no dramatic turning point that a storyteller would design. It began as one of the heaviest nights of my presidency, following news of a terrorist attack that had torn through civilians who had nothing to do with war, ideology, or power. Men, women, children, Names written on paper, numbers spoken aloud, silence after. I returned to my office long after midnight. The building was empty in the way only places of authority become after tragedy. Desks were clean, flags stood still, guards avoided my eyes. Leadership in those moments is not command, it is endurance. I sat alone, staring at reports I had already read. Every decision I had signed felt insufficient. Every order I had given felt late. I had trained for war. I had studied strategy. But no manual prepares you for the knowledge that your authority cannot prevent suffering, only respond to it. For the first time in a long while, I did not know what to do next. I remember leaning back, exhausted beyond language. My body shut down before my mind did. Sleep came without permission, heavy and abrupt, as if I had crossed a threshold I could not resist. What followed was not a vision in the way people imagine them. I did not see lights or symbols. I did not hear a voice calling my name. Instead, I became aware of a presence, unmistakable and overwhelming, not outside of me but surrounding me, pressing inward with clarity rather than force. I was conscious of my own thoughts, my own fear. I felt the residue of the images I had carried all day. And from that place, something broke open inside me. I did not call Allah. I did not call Jesus. I did not even know who I was calling. I spoke into the darkness with the honesty of a man who has nothing left to protect. God, I said, whoever you are, if you are there. The question that followed was not theological. It was not philosophical. It was the question of a man who carries responsibility without control. Why is there evil? Why are the innocent crushed? And what does it mean to lead when obedience cannot save everyone? There was no answer in words. There was no explanation offered. Instead, there was recognition. A knowing that did not come from logic but from certainty. I understood, without being told, that Jesus Christ was present, not as an image, not as a figure standing before me, but as truth made personal. The certainty was complete. It left no room for argument or doubt. It was not imposed, it was revealed. I did not analyze it, I did not test it, I surrendered to it. In that moment, I knew he was the Son of God, not because someone had convinced me, but because resistance no longer made sense. The weight I had been carrying did not disappear, but it was shared. For the first time, leadership did not feel solitary. I spoke again, quietly, without performance. Jesus, if you are real, I believe. I belong to you. There was no applause, no miracle, no promise of safety. There was peace, not relief from duty, but rest within it. I woke later with the dawn, unsure how much time had passed, aware only that something irreversible had taken place. That night did not remove my questions. It reframed them, and it began a journey I did not yet understand, one that would demand far more than private belief. After that night, my days did not become lighter. If anything, they became more demanding. Faith did not remove the weight of command, it sharpened my awareness of it. Each decision now carried a second gravity, not only the question of strategy, but the question of conscience. I was still surrounded by generals, advisors, foreign envoys, and intelligence briefings. Yet inwardly, I had entered a private discipline that no one had trained me for. I began to read the Bible late at night, not as a scholar, not as a critic, but as a man searching for orientation. I read slowly, often returning to the same passages, unsettled by how directly they spoke to fear, power, obedience, and humility. I did not read to confirm an ideology. I read because something in me needed grounding. I met a pastor in secrecy. There were no public schedules, no photographs, no formal titles. We spoke as two men, one guiding, one learning. He explained that faith is not sealed by emotion but shaped by obedience. He spoke of baptism not as ritual but as declaration, a death to one life and a rising into another, a visible act that confirms an invisible truth. That explanation troubled me more than comforted me. Baptism, I was told, is not merely personal, it is public. It is the moment when belief steps into the open and accepts consequence. It is obedience, not performance. And that was precisely the problem. I delayed. I told myself the time was not right. There were military campaigns underway, negotiations in progress, borders under threat. I argued that leadership required stability and that faith could wait for a calmer season. But beneath those reasons lived something less honorable: fear. I feared misunderstanding. I feared division. I feared being used as a symbol in conflicts I did not intend to create. I feared that a single act, however sincere, could fracture the delicate coexistence that holds my country together. And I feared, if I am honest, losing control of the narrative. So I prayed silently. I asked for wisdom quietly. I sought strength without naming its source. My faith was real, but it was hidden. And over time, that concealment began to feel less like prudence and more like compromise. I noticed a division forming inside me. In public, I was decisive, resolute, unyielding. In private, I was learning surrender. I was asking for guidance while refusing visibility. I was accepting comfort while avoiding cost. I remembered how boldly I had confronted foreign domination, how willingly I had accepted political consequences for the sake of sovereignty. And I could not escape the question that followed me into sleep. Why was I brave with power but cautious with truth? That question did not accuse me loudly. It waited. And when it returned, it did not come as a thought, but as a dream more real than waking life. The dream came after a day of relentless pressure. Meetings without resolution, conversations layered with diplomacy and threat, the kind of day that leaves the body exhausted but the mind restless. When sleep finally arrived, it did not feel like escape. It felt like passage. I found myself standing beside a river. The water was clear in a way no earthly water ever is, not reflective, not symbolic, simply alive. The air carried weight and light at the same time. I was dressed in white, though I had not chosen it. Nothing in that place felt accidental. I knew, without being told, that this was not imagination. It was more real than memory, more solid than the chair in my office or the desk where I sign orders. The clarity was absolute. Then he was there. Jesus stood across from me, not glowing, not distant, not abstract. He looked like a man of the Middle East, unremarkable in appearance yet impossible to ignore. His eyes held depth without judgment, eternity without threat. He spoke my name as one speaks to a friend, not a subject. Ibrahim. The sound of it disarmed me. Then, he asked a question that cut through every title I have ever carried. Who do you think you are? I began to answer the way leaders are trained to answer: president, commander, guardian of the nation. But before words formed, I understood the inadequacy of those labels. They described function, not identity. Office, not essence. He did not interrupt me. He waited. Then the distinction became clear, not spoken but known. Authority is something given for a time. Identity is something received. Titles can be removed. Sonship cannot. You are not first a president, he said. You are a child of God. I felt no rebuke in his voice, only truth. And then something even more unsettling. I placed you where you are, he continued. Not to rule from fear, but to lead from who you truly are. I realized then that my attempt to separate faith from leadership was not neutral. It was distortion. I had been trying to carry power without exposing source, to receive wisdom without acknowledging its giver, to follow privately while presenting myself publicly as self-sufficient. That was the compromise. He did not accuse me harshly. He revealed the contradiction gently, the way light reveals dust without condemnation. You ask me for guidance, he said, but you hide my name. You want my peace, but you avoid my path. I understood then that baptism was not about religion. It was about alignment, about refusing to live as two men, about allowing inner truth to meet outer life. He stepped into the river and turned toward me. Will you follow me completely, he asked. Not as a symbol, not as a politician, as who you are. I stepped forward. The water closed around me. There was no fear, only release. As I went under, I felt the weight I had carried dissolve. Not responsibility, but pretense. As I rose, there was freedom, not from duty, but from division. I will be with you, he said. Do not be afraid. I woke before dawn, my heart racing, my room silent. I knew without hesitation that this had not been a dream sent by exhaustion. It was an answer to months of prayer. From that moment, there was no longer a question of if, only when. When morning came, it did not erase the dream. It sharpened it. I rose before the call to prayer, before the city stirred, before the machinery of the state demanded my attention. I sat alone, aware that something had shifted permanently. The dream had not given me new information. It had stripped away my excuses. For months, I had told myself that discretion was wisdom, that silence was protection, that delaying obedience was the same as careful leadership. But now I saw the shape of that reasoning clearly. It was not wisdom. It was fear wearing the language of responsibility. The compromise was subtle, which made it dangerous. I had separated my inner allegiance from my public identity. I followed Christ in private and governed as if I were alone. I asked God for discernment while presenting myself to the world as the sole source of my decisions. I wanted the fruit of faith without the vulnerability of confession. I began to see how inconsistent that was with every other conviction I claimed to hold. I had challenged powerful nations without permission. I had rejected old systems of dependency knowing there would be punishment. I had spoken of dignity, sovereignty, and truth when it was costly to do so. I had accepted isolation rather than submission, and yet, when it came to faith, I hid. That realization unsettled me more than external threats ever had. The question that returned to me again and again was simple and merciless. Why was I willing to risk sanctions, pressure, and political attack, but unwilling to risk misunderstanding for the sake of truth? Why did I trust the people of Burkina Faso with hardship but not with honesty? I saw then that my fear was not only about national stability, it was also about control. Public faith introduces uncertainty. It allows others to interpret, criticize, distort. It removes the ability to manage every outcome. And leadership, especially military leadership, trains you to minimize uncertainty at all costs. But faith does not grow in controlled environments. It grows in surrender. I remembered the words spoken in the dream. You cannot ask for wisdom and hide the name of the one who gives it. You cannot accept the benefits of discipleship and refuse its cost. Those words did not condemn me. They clarified the path forward. I realized that I had already crossed the most difficult line. I believed. The question now was whether I would align my life with that belief or continue to live divided. There was no neutral ground left. That day, I prayed differently. Not for protection, not for timing, not for strategy. I prayed for courage to obey without theatrics and without concealment. I asked for wisdom not to provoke, not to divide, not to perform, but also not to hide. I understood then that obedience does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it simply refuses to retreat. By evening, I knew the decision had been made. I would be baptized, not as a political statement, not as a provocation, but as an act of coherence, an end to duplication, a refusal to live as two men. The remaining question was no longer whether I would obey. It was how. Once the decision settled, fear did not vanish. It became quieter, more honest. I stopped pretending it was wisdom and allowed it to be what it was, concern for consequences I could not fully predict. Faith did not remove uncertainty. It reframed my relationship with it. I returned to the words spoken to me in the dream. I had not been asked to create a religious state. I had not been instructed to favor one belief over another. I had been asked not to hide. The distinction mattered. Leadership in a multi-religious nation is not strengthened by spectacle. It is strengthened by integrity. I spoke again with the pastor. I told him everything, without filtering. The fear of Muslim reaction, the media narratives that would follow, the international speculation that would inevitably arise. He listened without rushing me toward reassurance. When he finally spoke, his words were simple. Obedience does not require noise, he said, but it does require truth. We talked about baptism again, about water as symbol and surrender, about how going down is not humiliation, and coming up is not triumph. It is alignment. It is saying openly what has already been decided inwardly. I realized then that I had misunderstood public faith. I had assumed it must be loud to be seen, dramatic to be real, but the call placed before me was quieter than that. I was not being asked to change the nation's religion. I was being asked to stop pretending that my inner life had no bearing on my outer one. The final anxiety I carried was about my Muslim brothers and sisters. I did not want them to feel betrayed. I did not want them to believe that my faith had changed my commitment to their safety or dignity. I did not want Christianity to be seen as a political signal rather than a personal truth. In prayer, the answer that returned was not strategic, it was relational. Do not explain before you act. Act with humility, then explain with care. That guidance shaped everything that followed. There would be no announcement in advance, no countdown, no grand declaration. The act itself would be simple. The explanation would come afterward, measured and precise. I also understood that obedience would not guarantee agreement. Some would praise, others would criticize, some would feel threatened, others relieved. Faith does not control reaction. It controls intention. On the night before the baptism, I did not sleep easily. I reviewed scenarios the way commanders do before operations. But beneath that preparation, there was a calm I had not known before. I was no longer negotiating with myself. I prayed again, briefly. Give me wisdom for my people, I said, and keep me honest. There was no answer in words. There was assurance in stillness. By morning, the path was clear. There would be no turning back, not because retreat was forbidden, but because division had become unbearable. What remained was to step into the water. The baptism had already happened once, before it ever touched my body. It had happened in the dream, in the river that did not belong to geography, in water that carried no temperature but absolute meaning. That mattered more to me than I understood at the time, because when the day came in the real world, there would be no spectacle to carry me, only memory, only conviction. In the days that followed my decision, I moved carefully, not secretly but deliberately. I spoke with advisors whose role was not to approve my faith but to help me protect the nation from misunderstanding. I listened more than I spoke. I allowed objections to surface fully. Some warned me again of reaction. Others reminded me that silence, once broken, cannot be restored. They were right, but silence had already become a lie. We agreed on something that surprised even me. The baptism would not be hidden, but it would not be advertised. No uniforms, no flags, no press invitation, no stage. It would take place in a church in Ouagadougou, quietly, in daylight, as a man, not as a symbol. I would explain afterward, not before. Truth would precede interpretation. When the day came, I dressed in white, not ceremonial white, simple white. I left my uniform behind because that was not the role I was bringing into the water. Titles do not enter baptism. They dissolve there. The church was modest. There were no crowds waiting outside. Inside, there was stillness, the kind that does not demand attention. The pastor asked the questions that have been asked for centuries, without adaptation for my position. Do you believe? Do you choose this freely? Do you surrender your life? My answers were not rehearsed. They were short, clear, unadorned. As I stepped into the water, the memory of the dream returned with precision. The river, the clarity, the absence of fear. When I went under, I did not feel exposed. I felt finished with something that had exhausted me. The old division, the double life, the constant calculation. When I rose, there was no rush of emotion, no surge of triumph. There was lightness, a quiet release, the feeling of a burden set down rather than a crown received. I stood there for a moment, water still moving around me, aware that nothing visible had changed and yet everything had. I had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, not because it was forbidden, but because it was unnecessary. Afterward, I prayed alone, not for approval, not for protection, for wisdom, for restraint, for the ability to speak without inflaming, to act without favoring, to lead without duplicity. I knew consequences would follow. Praise would come from some corners, suspicion from others, silence from many. Faith does not simplify the world, it clarifies your place in it. As I left the church, there were no cameras waiting, only the city continuing its day, vendors calling, traffic moving, life unaltered on the surface. But inside me, the long separation had ended. The consequences did not arrive all at once. They came in waves, uneven and unpredictable, as truth often does when it enters public space. Some responses were immediate, others waited, gathering shape before revealing themselves. I learned quickly that silence does not prevent reaction, it only delays it. Messages reached me through many channels. Some were written with gratitude, speaking of courage, honesty, and coherence. Others carried disappointment, suspicion, even anger. A few accused me of betrayal. Many simply asked what this meant for them, for their place in the nation, for the future they feared might shift beneath their feet. What struck me most was not the volume but the variety. The same act was seen as humility by some and as threat by others. That is the nature of personal truth when it becomes visible. It reflects what already exists in the observer. I addressed the nation carefully. Not to defend myself, but to clarify intention. I spoke plainly. I said that my faith was personal, not legislative. That Burkina Faso would not become a religious state. That no citizen would be favored or marginalized because of belief. That the Constitution, not my conversion, would continue to guide governance. I meant every word. Faith, when genuine, does not demand control. It demands integrity. It does not erase difference. It creates space for it without fear. I made it clear that my commitment to Muslims, Christians, and those of ancestral faith had not changed. What had changed was my refusal to live divided. Internationally, speculation followed. Analysts searched for hidden strategy. Commentators attempted to place my baptism within geopolitical narratives that had nothing to do with it. I did not respond to most of it. Not every interpretation deserves oxygen. Leadership requires discernment not only in speech but in restraint. Privately, something unexpected happened. I felt steadier. Not invulnerable, not triumphant. Steadier. Decisions did not become easier, but they became cleaner. I was no longer negotiating between two selves. I was no longer asking for guidance while pretending independence. The alignment brought peace. Not because problems disappeared, but because duplicity had. I remained a military leader. I continued to command operations against terror. I continued to negotiate, to refuse unjust pressure, to bear responsibility for life and death. Faith did not soften those realities, it humanized them. It reminded me that power is temporary, but consequence is not. I do not claim that this path guarantees success. I do not promise safety. I do not present myself as a model. I present myself as a man who chose obedience over concealment and coherence over convenience. If there is one result I did not anticipate, it is this. I sleep more honestly now. Not longer. Not always peacefully, but without the constant effort of maintaining two lives. That alone has changed the texture of leadership for me. What remains is not certainty, but direction, not perfection, but truthfulness. And that, I have learned, is enough to stand on. As I come to the end of this account, I am aware that some will still search for hidden motives, and others will search for reassurance. I cannot satisfy every expectation. What I can do is speak plainly, as a man who has learned that power without truth corrodes, and faith without integrity fractures the soul. I do not write to claim moral superiority. I write because silence, once useful, became dishonest. I have learned that leadership is not only measured by how firmly one stands against enemies, but by how honestly one stands before oneself. A nation can survive disagreement. It cannot survive deception forever. To my Muslim brothers and sisters, I say this clearly and without hesitation. My respect for you has not diminished. My responsibility toward your safety, dignity, and future has not changed. I have not abandoned dialogue, coexistence, or shared destiny. Faith, when genuine, does not cancel the humanity of others. It deepens responsibility toward them. To Christians, I offer no triumphal story. I offer a testimony shaped by fear, delay, and surrender. If anything in this account speaks to you, let it be this. Belief without obedience eventually becomes a burden. Faith is not proven by secrecy, but by alignment. To the leaders of the Sahel and of Africa, I speak as a fellow burden bearer. Our people do not need perfection from us. They need coherence. They need leaders who are not divided into public masks and private truths. Whatever your convictions, live them honestly. Whatever your beliefs, let them serve justice rather than ego. To the world watching from afar, especially those who look at Africa only through the lens of instability, understand this. Our nations are not experiments. They are homes. Leadership here is not an abstract exercise. It is lived daily among grief, hope, pressure, and consequence. When a leader chooses truth over convenience, it is not weakness, it is risk. I do not promise that my path will be easy. I do not promise that criticism will fade. I do not promise that faith will shield me from failure. What I promise is this. I will not live as two men again. I will not ask for wisdom while denying its source. I will not govern from fear of exposure. If there is a single invitation in these words, it is not to adopt my faith, but to examine your own life. Wherever you are, whatever you believe, ask yourself whether you are living in alignment or in division. Ask whether the world sees a mask or a person at peace with truth. I hope for a world less addicted to domination and more committed to dignity. I hope for an Africa that no longer doubts its worth. I hope for communities that reject hatred and return to paths of restraint, mercy, and responsibility. And I hope for myself to remain teachable, accountable, and human. Let those who hear these words respond as they see fit, reflect on them, question them, speak about them with honesty rather than anger. If you choose to stay engaged with this conversation, do so thoughtfully. Dialogue, when respectful, is one of the few forces stronger than fear. I end with this affirmation, not as a slogan, but as a responsibility I accept before history and conscience. I am Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso, and what I have spoken here is the truth as I have lived it. I stand as Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso, and these words are not invention but testimony. I speak as Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso, and I affirm that these things are true. May wisdom guide us, may restraint protect us, may the courage to turn away from what destroys us and return to what gives life find us all, wherever we stand.